Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and I'm joined by Doctors Rod Rosemallot, Scott Keith, and Adam Francisco. We are in the middle of a series on the great thinkers of the Christian faith, and we ended the last episode talking about Philip Melanchthon. He's a big figure in the German Reformation, and he's important to Lutheranism for just a ton of reasons. And last episode, we covered his sort of early background, his education, and the early time he spent at Wittenberg teaching and his relationship with Martin Luther. And today I thought we would finish Melanchthon. We would, or at least get to some of his major works. We talked about it a little bit before. In the last episode, we kind of hinted at some of the things he's written, major contributions to Lutheranism, and kind of the thought that follows him.
Sure. Yeah. So we ended off last time right around 1530. We'll go back a little bit to 1518, 1519 in a minute, but we ended around 1530 because that's the writing of the Augsburg Confession. I would think if our listeners want to get a flavor of Melanchthon, I'd say probably start with the Augsburg Confession. It's 28 articles, mostly paragraph 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, most of them are pretty short, and then there's a couple big ones.
Yeah, there's a couple big ones, but on the whole, you're talking about 28 to probably 36, 37, 38 paragraphs in total that you're writing. You could easily read it in a half an hour, I would guess.
I love contrasting it against the Apology too, and like how simple they thought it would be presenting it, and the reality.
They're really naive again. They just thought if they wrote it in an ironic way, not polemical, a friendly way, but they knew the content, that Rome would say, "Oh, we've really screwed up."
Yeah, so the historical background here, Adam, correct me at any point here, historical background here is that 1530, Emperor Charles V calls a diet in a town called Augsburg. Mm-hmm. And a diet is basically a gathering. Mm-hmm. And
a legislative, deliberative body of the imperial electors.
It's great.
And princes.
And what will be decided here are some political things, very much so, because they're very much worried about the Turks coming in to the imperial lands. And so the emperor is trying to sort of muster his forces at this point.
Yeah, there's all sort of like mundane stuff, bureaucratic kind of stuff. But the two big issues at Augsburg are the unity of the Holy Roman Empire, the German nation, so that it can deal with the Ottoman Turkish threat effectively, because just a couple months prior, the Ottomans had laid siege to Vienna, which was sort of like the gate to all of Western Europe,
and got in and won it.
Yeah, and well, they sent little like Ghazi raiding parties into like places like Bavaria, but they never wrestled Vienna from Ferdinand or Charles V. But that day was coming, because it was just by kind of if you will, a stroke of luck. It was a very wet summer that year, and so as the Ottomans are moving forward, their cannons and things are getting stuck in the mud. So they get to Vienna late in the campaign season, and they decide we're gonna retreat and fight another day. And they will try to, over the course of the 16th century. One of the things about the Reformation that's oftentimes missed is Luther probably should have or would have suffered the same fate as Jan Hus.
Should have been killed
in 1417. Yeah. If it wasn't for the distraction of the Muslim Turks. Yeah. And they will continue to be a distraction on Europe up until the 17th century, when on September 10th of 1683, they're laying siege to Vienna again, and it looks like they're going to win. And then a group of Poles come from the north, and September 11th, interestingly enough, finally turn the Turks definitively back to Istanbul, and that marks the kind of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. But in the preface, going back to the Augsburg Confession, I think it's the second sentence, as Melanchthon's writing or describing the occasion for the meeting, the diet at Augsburg, and the occasion for the Augsburg Confession. He says for the unity of the Holy Roman Empire, the German nation, Christian unity, so that it can deal with the ancient and hereditary foe of Christendom, Islam.
That's right.
Especially in its 16th century incarnation of the Ottoman Turks. So that historical thing is quite significant. And
one of the things that have been separating them is this theological dispute surrounding
the northern German territories would not give
electoral
forces.
Saxony specifically.
They wouldn't give troops, if you will, to Charles V to deal with the Turks, and Charles V needs them. So he's 1526, the first. I don't know if it's the first, but it's a Diet of Speyer. There's probably lots of Diets of Speyers. He grants concessions to to the protesting princes of northern Germany, the Protestants.
He's trying to get them to buy in.
Well, yeah, and he's trying to say, hey, let's not deal with this yet. Let's deal with the Turks first.
Deal with
and then
our immediate threat.
1528 or 1529, the Second Diet of Speyer, they renege on their concessions given to Lutheranism, and the Diet of Augsburg, the question comes up again. And Melanchthon, the reason why the Augsburg Confession is Irenic or conciliatory is he's trying not to irritate people, to say, hey, we Lutherans are basically Catholic, small c sense of the term, in our theology.
This is why some theologians will say that as early as 1530 in the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon begins to abandon Luther's pure theology. To be honest with you, is because these concessions that he makes in the Augsburg Confession in order to try to be Irenic, in order to try to gain unity.
Well, that makes sense. It also makes sense why Melanchthon did what he did.
Although Luther, when he reads it, calls it a pure exposition of evangelical doctrine.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I don't know that
those
you
two
could,
demand.
the threat of, this is me beating my own drum, but the threat of the Ottoman Empire coming into Europe, they had for about a century at this point. Back in the 1450s, they take Constantinople, transform it into Istanbul, which is in Turkish, Islambul, full of Islam. They attack Otranto on the boot heel of Italy in 1480, and the Pope himself has fled Rome because they're anticipating the Ottomans coming up through Rome, going over the Alps and into Western Europe, like they did back in the 8th century when the North African Berbers or Moors come into France and are stopped by Charles Martel. So
the hammer.
It makes sense why Melanchthon was conciliatory or Irenic. He's trying to keep the peace, if you will,
right?
So they can deal with this grave existential political threat.
Yeah, there's a legitimate fear even on the part of those in northern Saxony,
sure,
that the Islamicists or the Turkish hordes are going to win out, and they'll make it that far.
And they aren't like Europe. European fighters are bad. It's not like the modern sort of forces under the Geneva Convention. 16th century, they're nasty. Europeans and Turks are worse. They're taking pregnant women and cutting open their bellies and tearing out unborn children. They're beheading children, raping women before their husbands. This is serious stuff.
Nasty stuff
that people maybe aren't witnessing, but they're hearing about because it's going on. It's been going on in Hungary through the 1520s. So it's pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, so they would have heard about this for sure.
Yeah, one of my gripes, historically speaking, is that Reformation historians, up until very recently, haven't paid much attention to this stuff. And that this shapes a lot of not just the events of the Reformation, but Reformation thought. Why does Luther think that Daniel 7 is unfolding before his own day and age?
Yeah.
Because the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Melanchthon fits into that whole thing.
Absolutely.
Their friend Eustace Jonas.
That's right, Justice Jonas.
Writes a whole interpretation of Daniel 7 where the Ottoman Turks figure prominently. The other guys, Amsdorf and others are
convinced
things very much. Yeah. Like that's this way.
So 1530, Melanchthon writes the Augsburg Confession based on just so our confessional friends that are listening acknowledges based on a couple of other documents. People can listen to the episode on the Augsburg Confession to get that. The Roman Catholic Church responds with a confutation, right, which is not so ironic.
No, and it's embarrassing.
Apparently horrible scholarship.
It's embarrassingly bad. Melanchthon responds with the apology to the Augsburg Confession, which is much longer than the Augsburg Confession. It's a defense of what he originally wrote and a response to the confutation. I would say if people want to read those two things, you get a very, very good taste of Melanchthon's theology at its best.
If you want to tackle a paradigm, tackle Article 4. Now, in the Augsburg Confession... On justification. In the Augsburg Confession, it's not elongated at all when they realize that there's going to be nothing but hostility coming to them no matter how they behave or what sort of stance they take. They open the guns, and Melanchthon lays out the article of justification. And if you want to read just one, try that one.
Yeah, that's right.
It is from heaven itself,
Right. It's purely imputed righteousness from beginning to end.
Yep.
Which, if we ever have time to do an episode on the necessity of good works, I can explain sort of how that comes in later based on that. But Other things, Melanchthon writes the Loci Communis Theologici. It's important to note, if our listeners go out to find the English editions of those, that you'll find several translations of the early edition from 1521. And then you'll find one translation by J.A.O. Preuss that was originally labeled the 1543, was later labeled the 1559 edition. It's the same thing. It was, I don't know what CPH was doing early on, but it's really the last edition, the 1559 edition of the Loci Communis. So what you have essentially available to the reader in English is the first edition, 1521, the last edition in 1559, and nothing of the middle set of editions from 1535 to 1541.
Were you not the discoverer of that dating error?
I don't know that I was the only discoverer, but it did occur to me very early on in my research that something had happened with CPH where they decided to label it earlier than it actually was in the Corpus Reformatorum, which is the critical edition.
Interesting.
I don't know that I was the only one. I wouldn't claim that.
That's the kind of thing Germans usually do well.
Yeah, I wouldn't claim that, but it could have just been a decision because really from after 1541 to 1559, it's the same edition with minor variances in between. It's just that it was translated from the critical edition in the Corpus Reformatorum, and that is actually the 1559. So to label it, what happens is the introductory epistle or the introductory letter written from Melanchthon is in 1543.
Yeah, I will say the CR, having worked with the CR a little bit, the dating is sometimes weird because you'll be reading all of a sudden and then the date changes from what the front page on the CR said to what's
it's really
inside.
Odd.
Yeah,
I wrote a whole chapter in my dissertation on the critical notes in this Corpus Reformatorum as they pertain to
That sounds like fun work.
It's awful. But it's
slogging through footnotes.
It's necessary because it's confusing. Other things he's known for is the instruction for the visitors, 1527 to 1528, and then we should know him for the reform of the schools. If we pick up from where we left off, he's called as professor of Greek. He eventually becomes professor of Greek and theology at the University of Wittenberg. He writes widely, including works in exegesis, dogmatics, history, philosophy, apostles. Like we said, he writes sermons and books on preaching. He serves at least a couple terms as chancellor of the University of Wittenberg. So he's sort of in charge.
Oh, dear.
He very much is a theological ambassador. Back to chancellor, they took turns at that, though. And so it's sort of...
Nobody wants to do it.
Yeah,
they're kind of.
They took turns at it, and do
you want to be a bean counter?
They were elected to They were sort of elected by the faculty to the position for a term, and then they'd go out and somebody else would do it. That's maybe how it should work, right?
Yeah. I always illustrate with Westminster Seminary, and they don't have any admin.
Right.
The faculty handles it as much as. But they keep administration as zero as much as they can, which I think
how they do that with modern legal requirements.
It isn't that they're not being examined by the powers that we're examined by, but they're a seminary, not a 4-year liberal arts college.
Yeah,
you don't have that many students, but still, anybody would be like Hillsdale carrying forth the idea that you have a couple of administrators,
as few as possible.
As few as possible. Yeah. Those kind of people multiply in the darkness.
They're like rabbits.
Yeah.
Again, just thinking back to the early episode, he's had some very primary early influences beyond just Luther. Luther was certainly one of his early influences, but you have Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536, known as really the humanist, right? The scholar of his time. Melanchthon was often called the second Erasmus. I mean, he was regarded as highly as Erasmus, not for his theological works, but just for his works in philology and study of language and classics.
And if you want to sell a book, you want Melanchthon to write a preface to it, right?
That's right, yeah.
There's a lot of prefaces that Luther and Melanchthon and others wrote that to bizarre things like Aesop's Fables or the Quran or and all these other things.
Sure. He would see it as the preceptor and how to get a grip on this particular piece of knowledge and do it efficiently. And wonderful. That kind of guy has a real place. How do I get knowledge of this field in the shortest possible time, but get it accurately? I think of J.I. Packer and the number of blurbs that he wrote for different works through the years. It must be uncountable.
Right.
Number of people for whom he wrote.
We're getting to be like that at 1517 with you doing introductions, Rod.
I bet over your career you've been asked to write tons of prefaces or forwards or endorsements.
Yeah.
Another great influence was his great uncle, Johann Reuchlin, a famous humanist also. Again, we don't mean secular humanist there. We mean essentially somebody who's studying the language and classical literature, right? Yeah, someone to the sources, going back to the original sources. He was a great Hebraist. He was one of the early studiers of the Hebrew language, passed that love of the original language on to Melanchthon. He regarded Melanchthon so highly that he, at one point, had willed to Melanchthon his entire library. An interesting point is that later on, when Melanchthon becomes so entrenched with Luther, and Luther becomes such a lightning rod figure, Reuchlin stays with the Roman Catholic Church, as does Erasmus. He writes Melanchthon several letters telling him to break away from Luther after he had recommended that Melanchthon go take the job at the University of Wittenberg because of Luther in the first place. And when Melanchthon refuses, he literally writes Melanchthon out of his will.
Oh,
interesting.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah. Later on, though, Reuchlin is accused of heresy, really, because of his study of the Kabbalah and his sort of integration with Jewish
with
mystical
numbers
studies.
and weird stuff like that.
He's acquitted of that. I mean, he's never burned for it.
Good.
But, it's called the Reuchlin affair. It's a trying time in Reuchlin's life for sure.
Well, didn't the humanists, the Reformation humanists,
rallied
relearn Hebrew from the Kabbalah?
Well, they also rallied to his aid and wrote books in Reuchlin's favor that made fun of those that were attacking him for studying Hebrew. It's an interesting. Maybe we should do an episode on it. It's an interesting time. I kind of like Reuchlin. The people that were greatly influenced by Melanchthon, for those of you who are familiar with the name Martin Chemnitz, you'd have to say that Chemnitz was certainly influenced greatly by Melanchthon, to the degree that Chemnitz lived in Melanchthon's house for a while he was studying at the University of Wittenberg.
Was he didn't he marry Melanchthon's daughter or something like that?
I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
But I know that
you're thinking Caspar Crucier.
Oh, Pusser.
That's right. Yeah. Sorry, Pusser.
Yeah. But I do know that he wished that he would have studied theology under Luther, but arrived too late and tried to get as many student notes as he could because he had been in astronomy, astrology, math, and was trying to pick up quickly from student notes what he had missed.
Well, it's interesting. So Chemnitz lives with Melanchthon in 1553. 1554, he's offered a position to join the university faculty at Wittenberg, and he does. And while he's at University of Wittenberg, he lectures on Melanchthon's Loci. And it's the lecture notes that J.A.O. Preuss translates into the CPH edition of Chemnitz's Loci Communes. As J.A.O. Preuss is translating that, he realizes that he's translating so much Melanchthon as he translates Chemnitz that he turns around and goes ahead and finishes translating the 1559
because he's done most of it already,
and publishes both. Calvin is also greatly influenced by Melanchthon, especially by means of the correspondence that the two had with one another. Richard Muller, who I think is probably one of the primary Calvin scholars.
Oh, absolutely.
Notes that Calvin disagreed with Melanchthon regarding the use of the Loci method only as opposed, and preferred. Calvin preferred to use what he would call a biblical commentary method, where you're simply taking the text of Scripture and commenting on it and explaining it. Thus, you have Calvin's commentaries. And
Calvin. I was sitting under Richard Muller after quite a few beers. Sort of when you find somebody like that who's really knows their stuff, and he started to deliver of himself after everybody else had left, and I stayed. and he explained how Calvin didn't want to duplicate anything. So if you get particular editions of the Institutes, particular editions will show you in the critical notes where it is in the commentaries. Mm-hmm. So all he had to do was reference it. And you, buying that edition of the Institutes, can do the same thing. He'll send you to the commentaries with precision.
Yeah. So Calvin utilized much less the actual Lochi method as a primary way for seeing how to understand theology properly. So we're going to take a break. When we get back, all I really want to do is go through maybe some of the controversies that Melanchthon was involved with, and then sort of some of his main teachings, and then take any more questions that Adam and Rod maybe want to stump me on.
Welcome to our break. Today we're going to talk about a conference called Here We Still Stand. It's a celebration of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And on the topic of Melanchthon, Dr. Keith, you're going to be maybe giving a little presentation about Melanchthon there while you're...
Yeah, I am. Here We Still Stand Conference, Reformation Conference, October 19 through 21, 2017 at the Hyatt Regency Mission Bay Spa and Marina in San Diego,
Nice
California.
place to suffer for Jesus.
It sure is. We actually have one more registration discount deadline left. If you register by June 30th, 2017, it's $179 for the conference, not the rooms, for the conference. The ticket price includes all main sessions, breakouts of your choice, plus a dessert buffet on Thursday night, breakfast, lunch, and dinner on Friday, and breakfast on Saturday.
It's a lot for that amount of money.
Right. One more discount deadline. It's $179 by June 30th.
How much does it go up, just so they know?
It'll go to $199, so it's a $20 discount.
Yeah, it's totally worth it.
Yeah.
Months ago, I was in Kentucky, and people were talking about going.
Good. Yeah, we got a lot of people talking about going. We have a couple hundred registered. We'd like to see another couple hundred registered in the next couple weeks. So get on that. I'd say.
So if you're a listener to the show, we've talked about this conference a couple times. If you've just been waiting to pull the trigger, it's a good time to do it because you're coming up against when it's going to get more expensive yet again.
And spend a couple more days in Southern California.
Yeah,
I mean, it is the land of weirdos, but...
not at the Hyatt Mission.
San Diego,
Regency.
go visit the... What's the aircraft carrier down there?
California is a great place to visit.
Come visit
even
me
if you
in
don't want to
San
live
Juan
there.
My grandkids loved visiting that.
Yeah.
Loved visiting.
The Midway, right?
Midway,
USS Midway.
Come see Orcas. This is like one of the last times you're going to be able to see
Well, the
orcas.
shows are done.
Oh,
Don't
that's
even
sad.
get me going. I want to do an episode on how millennials ruined SeaWorld.
San Juan Capistrano Mission, 1776. Come see the Francisco family. Well,
I can give you his address.
no, don't do that. But
You sure?
in spirit, we'll meet.
Okay.
It's in San Juan Capistrano, so drive around, and when you see a
You'll
red
see
Jeep,
us. You'll see a red Jeep, and you'll see a bunch of kids running around with a bull mastiff, and
Oh my
it's
God.
us.
All right, so yes, I'm speaking there. It's a great lineup, although I'm coming last, which kind of freaks me out a little bit. But it's a lunch panel discussion with Rod Rosenblatt on Friday, October 20th at 12 p.m. 2 p.m. will be Stephen Paulson, lecture on Martin Luther, and 3:15 p.m. will be Scott Keith, a lecture on Philip Melanchthon. 7 p.m. that night will be a lecture with Dr. John Warwick Montgomery.
That's worth the money.
While he's
Dinner with Montgomery.
where he's talking about why the Reformation still matters.
Very cool.
Great
And
subject.
If you're coming the first day, the registration day, when you're getting everything ready, Friday, we are recording a live show there at the
Oh, that's
conference.
right. Yeah, I forget about
So-
everybody's recording a live show that day. Like, you're going to get a chance to maybe sit in on a recording of Thinking Fellows, Virtue in the Wasteland, Front Porch with the Fitzes, 40 Minutes in the Old Testament, Ringside with the Jagged Word guys, everybody.
Yeah, it's a big lineup. So if you're a fan of the show, this is your opportunity to get us all in one place. So it's gonna be a fun time. I'm sad I'm not gonna be there the whole time, but
Where are you going to be?
Nevada.
Oh, lame.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is unfortunate.
Very lame.
Yeah,
What are you doing?
Carson's wedding.
Oh, yeah. Best friend's wedding. That's probably
Yeah, best friend's wedding. So
best
it's a
friend since kindergarten.
yeah, long time. Or no, longer than that now. 17 or 18 years. So
All
It's
right.
been a long time. All right, back to the show. Melanchthon.
Controversies, all right?
Oh, yeah. He's full of them, right?
He's absolutely full of them. You have some, like with Conrad Cordatus, he's a preacher in, I want to say Nemec, attacked Melanchthon for his 1535 Loci, where Melanchthon uses the phrase, good works are necessary to salvation.
Yep.
I know somebody that wrote a PhD dissertation on that phrase. Might come out someday. That's an interesting controversy. There's the antinomian controversy, which began in 1527 when Melanchthon urged that the law be preached in order to prevent the abuse of free grace. And somebody named John Agricola held that the law had no place in the life of the Christian.
You mean that's not a new heresy in 2016?
No, that's
15,
1527, 1535, it comes out again when Melanchthon, for the first time, developed something that has come to be known as the third use or the third function of the law. Doubles down on that. Second antinomian controversy in 1556, 4 years before Melanchthon's death. Again, third use of law is what's issued here. The Formula of Concord, Article 6, deals with this by recognizing, triple use of the law for outward discipline, for revealing sin, and for the rule of the life of the regenerate.
Well, would it be fair to say the catechesis into that? The didactic use of the law, informing what the shape that the Christian life is.
We've done an episode on that, and I think people should look at that if they need clarification on that.
Yeah.
The long story short is that Melanchthon finds himself in controversy after controversy after controversy. Matthias Flacius, however you want to say it, opposes Melanchthon after the death of Luther, when Melanchthon participates in the Augsburg and the Leipzig interims in order to sort of gain some peace with the invading imperial armies who have taken over sort of the northern, we'd call it German lands now, lands of Saxony. He's just so encrusted in these controversies that when he dies in 1560, some of his last words are, "Lord, save me from the ragings of the theologians." And I've got to say, in an interesting way, I never really thought I'd relate to that phrase until the last couple of years, where
I was going to say, I get that.
Where sometimes I just want to be saved from the ragings of the theologians.
Yeah.
That's why you claim to be a historian, right, Adam?
What do you mean claim?
Well, I'm sorry.
Whoa.
or claim not to be a theologian. You are a historian.
Yes, sir.
But you don't do theology.
Yeah.
Never.
Well, only when it's important.
It's like Dr. Godfrey, the premier professor of church history, and with a wink he'll say, "But I'll leave that to the theologians. I'm simply a church historian."
It's so nice.
Nestigan will say that too. Nestigan says that all the time. Well, I'll leave that to the theologians.
Yes.
I'm just a church historian.
Yes.
I'm a lowly farm boy who studied church history.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Lewis did that too. He'd say, "I'll leave this to the theologians," after he's just written something so definitive. You just,
I'm just a literary.
It's funny you say that.
There was a time when theology was not,
Well, every time Adam says, "I'm not a theologian," I do think of Lewis. It's kind of funny.
Sure.
Thank you. Adam can come out with some of the most profound theological statements that I've heard, and then say, "Well, I'm not a theologian.
Yeah.
I'm a historian."
The first big piece of literature, Herodotus, the histories, or the researches, it's history. It's not until 2nd century, 3rd century AD where you get actually theology. So,
Well, it sort of makes sense, the advent of Christ.
And theology is always, in a way, understand this correctly, a product of a particular context. Again, understand this correctly. I'm not saying it's...
Yeah.
Listen to Adam being postmodern over here.
No, I'm not. No, that's why I said understand it correctly.
Yeah.
It's like Luther. Sometimes people call Luther the occasional theologian, and they don't mean he's like occasionally doing theology. It's like there are these particular, like with Melanchthon, controversies that require
need addressing.
Where you have to be really particular. Where in normal context, you wouldn't necessarily be so obsessive about 0.1, 0.9 times 0.6.
Right. You can see.
Doctrine.
You can even understand the Augustana, the Augsburg Confession in that light. Kind of the Formula of Concord. There's no way to argue around the idea that the Formula of Concord is a reaction to all these controversies.
Sure.
Right.
I mean,
Sure.
it's written, say, can we get some unity on these things
Sure.
that we've been fighting about for 30 years?
Concord means harmony.
Right. And so they propose these two documents and say, can we at least agree on this much?
Mm-hmm.
So this is contextual in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So theology, what is Melanchthon known for? I'd say a couple things, several things, and we don't have really time to go into law and gospel, but I'd certainly say law and gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. And you've covered some of this already and well.
Right. But let's just take maybe a couple of things. I'd say ad fontes, first of all. I think it's important to know that even as a theologian, he's certainly still a humanist. And this idea of ad fontes, or return to the sources, is very important to him throughout his life.
Yep.
When he first begins to contribute to the world of theology to when he dies in 1560, he's very concerned with a return to the original sources, particularly the Greek, Latin, and Hebrew sources, to the Bible specifically, in Greek and Hebrew. This really drives his theological work, even as it pertains to applying what he learns from his study of the Bible in Greek and Hebrew by means of the Loci method.
Yeah.
He never abandons the Loci method. I'm not saying that, but first and foremost, go to the text, study it in the original languages, let the text breathe out to you what it is saying, and then use the Loci method to organize what you see that it says as you study it in the Greek and the Hebrew.
I've heard people just classify him, or I've even heard it talked down. He was just a systematician. And I think that's just not fair. I think he was an exegete and a biblical scholar above all else.
He's an exegete. He's primarily an exegete.
Par excellence. I mean, his commentary, Romans, it's early, isn't it? Like 1519 or 20... early 20s or something.
His commentary. I didn't hear you.
Commentary on the Romans?
Yes, 1520.
It's remarkable. It's such an early
There are
stage.
other editions. There are other editions, of course. But the earliest one's 1520.
Luther's commentary on Romans is a commentary by a faithful son, an Augustinian son of the Roman Church.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And people will hear Luther, Book of Romans, and think, "Wow, he hadn't really."
Right. Yeah.
Melanchthon's is the work of an exegete. You know, he's going at the text. He's allowing the text to breathe the truths, and he's using the Loci method to organize those truths, to communicate them to you and I and to his students.
Yep.
You know? So ad fontes, to the sources, to the fountain, absolutely.
Can I ask about the two kinds of righteousness? I believe that originates in Melanchthon. Is that correct?
Well, it's argued that it originates in Melanchthon.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's true. I think that's accurate.
I think I know it's.
I mean, for the listeners, what they're
controversial,
talking about is inward and outward righteousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Inward righteousness is that righteousness which no one will ever see. You and I can't see from the outside.
It's an accomplished.
Only
fact
God can
and,
see. It's the righteousness of Christ applied to us by means of imputation, right?
Alien.
It's
right?
alien outside of us. We stand in the shadow of Christ. Listeners can't see me, but I always do that. Like that picture I use when I'm teaching to students, where the cross of Christ is casting a shadow on the sinner, and God is looking and he sees the cross of Christ, not the sinner. That kind of righteousness. External righteousness is that whatever righteousness we find, and I'd say primarily by means of vocation, right, in our daily lives, that is actually externally visible, right? You're one day a good husband. You're one day a good father. And people can see this, and that's your external righteousness.
I think the Latin is coram hominibus.
It
is
is.
that right? So
Yep.
before man, it's all horizontal from start to finish. It does not affect or cause any sort of thing.
It does not
between you and
merit.
God
Does not merit
vertically.
justification in any
It's
sort of
purely horizontal.
Right.
Yeah.
And even can Melanchthon say that even the pagans can pursue
he would say that.
horizontal or
Yeah, well, he
active
would say that. He does say that.
Civil righteousness.
Yeah, he holds in high regard people like Cicero, Aristotle, Quintilian.
Yeah.
And he would very much say that they achieve, in many ways, a higher civil righteousness or external righteousness than most Christians. You know?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that
Or most people of
he
the
and
book,
Luther
right?
write about Cicero, and being the greatest of pagans, and
Right.
if only they could have known Christ.
Melanchthon would love to go back and preach that guy into heaven. And he would.
Yep.
Yeah. He acknowledges that he's not, right? He acknowledges that he's a pagan.
Unlike a few other.
Yeah, you get the
humanists.
sense that he's not real happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but he acknowledges that. Which gets us to sola scriptura. This is, I think, foremost on Melanchthon's mind, the idea of scripture alone. The idea that we know God only really through his word alone. Now, I think at some point Adam wants to ask me about astrology, which may play into this a little bit. But let me give you a little. This is a quote from Melanchthon. This is what he says. However, God cannot be dealt with and cannot be grasped in any other way but by his word. Accordingly, justification takes place through the word. Now, by that, what he means is, of course, the word is preached. The sinner hears the word. The Holy Spirit works through that word. And by working through that word, creates faith in the heart of the unbeliever. Romans 1:16, Romans 10:17, and other passages like that. So, you have what we've come to call subjective justification, or the benefits of Christ are applied individually to the believer on account of their faith, which is indwelled in them by the power of the Holy Spirit. Is that not good?
It's okay.
Okay. If there's a better way to say it,
it'll work.
Okay.
It'll work. As long as we keep the same focus that they had, that the faith which saves is given to us supernaturally, and that it's not
a work.
Right.
Or
it's not meritorious.
Not meritorious. He says that over and over again. In fact, I've translated from 1535 things that say that they can go check out at 1517.com under my name.
Sure.
Where he says time and time again, these aren't meritorious. And I don't mean to imply that either. I mean, basically what I said is almost straight out of Mueller, but it's not meritorious.
Right.
But it is faith indwelled by the proclaimed word and the work of the Holy Spirit.
Yep.
Of course, sola gratia, this idea that we're saved by grace alone. This is a great line from Melanchthon, but it is the exclusive particle in the word. It's an interesting phrase. People struggle with translating that, and I do too. But this is sort of the only, right? This is the only grace saves type of thing, or grace alone type of thing.
The Romans will sign to that, and then you find out they have 37 different kinds
a different
of
definition
grace.
for grace.
Yeah, and finally, when I was debating Carl Keating, he said that's only because you're using a Protestant lexicon.
Well, get this,
that's not true.
But it is the exclusive particle in the word of grace, to wit, that it is gratuitously given remission of sins and reconciliation on account of Christ alone.
Terrific.
Yeah, try that on for size for Catholics.
Yeah, terrific.
Of course, he holds to the idea that faith comes through faith alone, too. Melanchthon claims a couple of things. This is from Melanchthon. Faith signifies trust, and this is, in Latin, this is the word fiducia. It's a little, I think, misrepresentative to translate it as just trust. Justus Jonas, as Adam said, or I'll just say it for the English speakers, Justus Jonas, who was a colleague of Luther and Melanchthon, was often tasked with translating Melanchthon's Latin into German. In fact, the 1555 edition of the Loci Communities, which has been translated into English, was translated from a German translation of Justus Jonas that he had translated from Latin into German, of Melanchthon, then German into English. Said that it was always very difficult to translate Melanchthon's Latin because he often needed to use 10 or 12 words of German to translate one word of Melanchthon's Latin. And I think the same is true here when you get to this idea of trust or fiducia. I think it's important to see it as like a heartfelt confidence that relies on Christ alone when you see this. And I can only say that from years of looking at Melanchthon using fiducia. You couldn't just get that if you were studying Latin and ran into fiducia. You'd simply say trust. But from just years of reading Melanchthon, and he uses this word, he means a heartfelt confidence that relies on Christ alone. I mean, that's what he means. But we translate it trust. So faith signifies trust in the promised mercy on account of Christ, right? So that's where I get this whole sort of formulation. Another thing he says is this faith grabs hold of the promise of the gospel. That's where I kind of get the appropriating the benefits of Christ on account of faith, or through faith on account of Christ. Faith apprehends Christ as the ultimate mediator. Again, a work of the Holy Spirit through the proclaimed word.
Well, it saves us from all that God talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huh?
Yeah.
It sharpens it right down to blood, splinters, cross, death, tomb, resurrection, gift. None of this God stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm going to land on one more that will illustrate that even more. This idea of on account of Christ alone, or propter Christum solus Christus, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So propter Christum is on account of Christ alone.
And not on account of faith.
That's right. That's right. Oh, man. You want to hear that driven home, you listen to some lectures by Ferdy that I've heard. It's just great. But what he's saying here is we're saved only on account of Christ. So even when we talk about faith, we're saved only on account of Christ. Even when we talk about grace, we're saved only on account of the grace.
Over and over and over.
Because of Christ, right? And the Latin word is propter. It can be translated on account of, because of, for the sake of. You can do this a lot of different ways, but what you're getting at is that the only reason this is happening to you is because of this something else that's coming down the road here, and that something else is Christ. So Melanchthon says we are justified freely by his grace, Christ's grace, that is by God's mercy, so that we understand that we are pleasing to God not on account of the dignity of our own works or merit, but on account of Christ alone.
Yes.
And so that this is the type of thing you get in Melanchthon time and time again that's so great, that's so wonderful, that can bring tears to your eyes. And then you get some of the controversies where he says other things that make people scream, to the point where he even adjusts the Augsburg Confession at points. He relies on astrology at times.
Very normal for the age.
Very normal for the age. He very much thinks that he can see that if it's God that is, the ordaining all the movements of the stars, that God has given us reason that it makes sense that we should be able to study the stars and discern his will. It's not astrology in the modern sense where you're sort of looking at the zodiac and all of that. It's much more trying to discern God's will by virtue of the heavens and our ability to reason them.
We have that very unusual passage in Luke that the philosophers from the East, or the professors from the East, come to worship the newborn King of Israel.
Based on this.
Based on that.
Yeah.
And I went, oh, holy smokes.
Yeah. So like Adam says,
Galatians 2, Galatians 3, and the law of the universe and things like that are kind of weird.
This is very common, like Adam said, in the time. And all I want to point out is that Melanchthon gets into a bunch of controversies, and he really says some things that are unfortunate. And really what he does is he makes changes to documents that he should not make changes to.
Yep.
He makes changes to the Augsburg Confession. He should not do that.
Yep.
Even
There's a reason we have on our cornerstones in our churches UAC.
Yeah, unaltered Augsburg Confession.
Unaltered. That means not twiddled with by the author Melanchthon. Yeah. Unaltered Augsburg
Not
Confession.
the Variata, the Variation, or the Invariata, none of that.
No.
But the unaltered. And he makes changes, and as I said, even when we were going over the Loci, you have sort of these series of editions of the Loci, 1521 to 1530, 1535, 1541, 1543 to 1559. He changes this document too. I mean, this document that Luther said, if someone who wants to study theology had the translation of the New Testament and the Loci, they'd have enough. Well, he changes it, and he changes it, and he changes it, and he changes it, and he changes it. And
he saw it as his own personal essay, and in the sense that he somehow owned it. And you can understand that. Any author can understand that. But in this case, if it's going to be confessional status, don't twiddle with it.
Right. And interestingly enough, the Loci was considered for confessional status many times as they were approaching the Book of Concord.
Was the 1521 edition or the 1530s?
I'd have to look at it again, but I want to say it's probably the later edition.
Interesting.
Was considered for inclusion, but so was things like the bondage of the will, right? Was on the table for inclusion in the Book of Concord.
That'd be awful.
We probably should mention where he really stepped in it later on.
Yeah, the use of the will is one of the big perceptions.
Yes.
1535, he says that man's will is one of the causes of his conversion. It should be clarified that if you've ever studied Aristotle, he's using Aristotelian categories here for causes.
Yep.
Where he's not using it in a way that would say this caused that. He's more saying that the will is one of the things that's changed in your conversion, and thus it's one of the causes in the Aristotelian sense. But still, it's problematic, right?
Yeah, that doesn't get across in English.
No, it doesn't get across in English. It didn't get across to people at his time that weren't as acquainted with Aristotle as he was. And it was a problem. 1535, he also says good works are necessary to salvation.
Yeah.
Again, I think he intends something different by that, which is very clear if you read two sentences after he says that. But still, on its own,
worth knowing.
You can pull that sentence out and you can say, look at what this guy said, and he did say it. He does participate in both the interims, in the Leipzig and the Augsburg interim, which are highly controversial. They bring in many, bring back into the Lutheran practices many Roman Catholic practices
by force
that had been let go of for good reason. I would say that we maybe are bringing back some of those practices today, which bothers me a little bit. I saw some pictures that Adam sent me on Good Friday of particular churches and certain dress and people laying it. I'm not going to name the names, but some of those practices were exactly what Melanchthon allowed back in during the interims that were opposed then by the Gnasia or the authentic Lutherans. He does things like that. He changes the Augsburg Confession. In one of the editions of the Augsburg Confession on the article on the Lord's Supper, he is said to append it such that it becomes more appealing to the Calvinists in that he loosens the language on the bodily presence of Christ in the supper.
It goes back to like the Wittenberg Concord with Martin Bucer and company.
Yeah, and those are ones where he just ought not to have done it.
Right. I will
try to cut him a whole lot of slack because, again, you could be burned at the stake and things were awful.
Right. Well, people were dying in 1548, right? People were being killed in 1548. And people were being run out of their homes in 1548. And he makes these concessions that really, I probably in the end of the day try to save lives. And I go with Robert Kolb on some of this and say it's sort of unfair to apply to Melanchthon Luther's standard. In other words, from 1521 on, Luther pretty much stays around Wittenberg. He's protected by the elector.
Yes.
And he's able
Roman
to
Catholic elector.
Yeah, he's able to write dirty notes to the Pope, wrap them around a rock, tie the rock up with a string and throw it at the Vatican. And he's got this protection. And Melanchthon doesn't really have that same sort of protection in a way because the elector is sending him out. He's sending him, go make peace here, go make peace there. Robert Kolb calls him the ambassador for the Lutheran Reformation, and in his ambassadorial role, he makes concessions. But these in a lot of ways, he's being told to make these concessions by the person that's paying his salary. And so it's
tough.
It's tough situation. He's in a situation that Luther wasn't in because Luther was under the ban. I mean, that is hard for Luther, I'm sure, but in a way it's sort of freeing because, you're now already excommunicated. You can say anything you want to say. And your elector is going to protect you. So it's an interesting time. I think it's hard for us, and we should be reticent to castigate these characters too much.
Yeah, I agree.
Without understanding the complete context of their historical situation, where Adam comes in, right? The complete context of the historical situation.
Yeah,
and the politics involved.
Real threat.
Yeah.
Genuine threat.
And there was probably more politics
stake.
at play in this than there was, at least, I'll say it this way, at least as much political maneuvering at play as there was theological maneuvering.
Yeah.
We, the theologians, pastors, and whatnot, tend to see this only as theology.
Black and white.
And
or in abstracto instead of in concreto.
I mean, here's an example of that before we get out of here. 1535, Melanchthon makes a major change to the Logia Communis from the 1521 edition. 1535, there's certain things going on in a little place called England, right, with King Henry. Right?
The British Isles?
Yes.
Okay.
The British Isles. Melanchthon,
and probably because the electors who are protecting Luther know at some point the imperial forces are going to come up. They want to get political alliances together to face the armies of the emperor if it should ever happen. They're trying to get Henry on their side, Henry VIII, right, on their side. And so one of the things Melanchthon does in 1535 when he writes the new Logia Communis is he dedicates it to Henry VIII. This is interesting. If not for anything else, he does get 500 gulden for doing that, which is about a year's salary for him. Which I wouldn't mind writing something. I would dedicate my next book to anybody if they want to give me a year's salary.
Absolutely.
I mean.
But if you just go on Google and type like a political map of Germany in the 16th century, you'll get a picture, like a geographical picture
of how interesting it was,
complicated it is.
Yeah.
From you got the electors and princes and dukes and
and of course an elector was somebody who would be able to vote for who was the next emperor and would also be eligible to be voted to be emperor. So it's interesting that Luther's protector was an elector, which meant that he could have run for elector when Charles V got it, and maybe makes some sense why he's not so willing to cooperate with Charles V when Luther sort of does his little theological rebellion.
There's a lot of
Did I get that right,
There's
Adam?
a lot of politics involved in
Yeah.
not on the part of Luther, Melanchthon, and others, but the people who are protecting Luther.
That's right.
Frederick
Who signs the
Wise
Augsburg
and-
Confession?
The princes.
Yeah.
The prince.
The politicians.
Yeah, it's amazing. I had a friend who did that in what do you call it? What kind of script?
Fraktur script or
I think it was the old German script.
oh yeah.
But there with all the signatures.
Signed his name.
You know?
Yeah.
And they were putting their lives on the line.
Right.
yeah.
And asked permission whether they could sign it.
Yep.
Gosh.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like it's on the same level of for our American audience, which is most of our audience, of the Declaration of Independence.
That's right.
With this, we pledge our lives and
Yeah.
our honors and our
Our
honor and
dignity and our sacred honor. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a declaration that we are
Our fortune. Sorry. Our lives, our fortune, our sacred honor.
Yes.
are they're acknowledging that present circumstances, or according to present circumstances, that they are traitors.
Yeah.
that
Right.
They
Yeah.
deserve the death penalty.
Yeah.
and yet they do it.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's what we call in California cojones.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
All right, Caleb.
All right. Thank you for listening to the show. We will catch you next time.